So yesterday, we finished talking about how the president can mobilize public support to try to use, say, public opinion as a way to, as a leadership method, as a way to get some kind of pressure, uh, some kind of momentum uh, into Congress, right, to assist the president in getting things really done. And it's a monumental task to try to move public opinion or motivate the public. So it doesn't generally work out to be a very effective thing, but if you can do it, that's useful. And the last thing we're going to talk about with the presidency, and I think it's very apropos, given our last 4 years with this president, is how it is that the office of president and the individuals that fill that office interact with the media, back and forth. And we hear people all the time talking about the media seems to always be attacking the president. And the last 4 years, it's the media attacking Trump. The previous 8 years, it was the media attacking Obama. The previous 8 years, it was the media attacking Bush Jr. And I guess really that tells us something, right? That most of the time the media sets itself up in opposition to the leadership of the government, right? Especially the president. And that's because it's kind of their natural status. It's their job to always be picking at the whatabouts and the what ifs and what are the other options, right? That's where the media is making their mark, in a sense. Is okay, regardless of who the president is, you say you're going to do X. Well, why is X better than Y? Why is X better than Z, right? And that's going to be right, natural, I think, in the interaction, because the job of the media is always question. The job of the media is to take what the government is giving them, and the president, right, is part of that, and try to examine it both for what it's good for and what it's bad for, and who it's going to help and who it's going to hurt. And then to build a narrative around it that is results in a story that people, right, will pay attention to, because never forget, the media is a business, right, and its job is to ensure that the product it's making is watched, is consumed. So you've got the media trying to always make a story out of every piece of information they have, and the president's office quite often is only wanting to deliver a particular perspective or a particular view on a story. If they want to get information out at all, sometimes they don't. But when they do, they want to have very strict clamps on where that story is going, what that information is about, how they're going to have to support it and talk about it. And so in that sense, they're really trying, through the press secretary and through other spokespersons, not just the president directly, but including them, they're trying to have a strong control over whatever the message is. Since probably before, but very easily, demonstrably since Reagan, right? The presidential office has had generally has had a game plan for dealing with the media, right? Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, right? Obama actually had pretty strong internal plans and cohesion about what the message is going to be to the media, how everybody in the administration is going to be delivering the same message. That if you weren't responsible for delivering the message, then you didn't address the media at all. And generally, this has been a fairly successful approach, right? Reagan put rules out for his group about how they were going to stay on message, stay on topic, only talk when they absolutely needed to, ignore the media as much as possible until they had to engage with them. And then when they did, they'd all engage with the same story, the same message, the same words, the same references. And most administrations have picked up on that way of dealing with the media, so that you don't get, right, the media hearing story one and story two, about the same thing. And so, how do I think they're going to treat Biden? I think they'll treat him the way they treated most presidents, and that's in the first couple months, they'll be pretty good to him, and then the first full-blown issue, right? They'll be the media, and they will, they'll be in that adversarial position again, and they'll be, just like they have with every other president, they'll be bringing up the most pointed and delving questions that they can, because their job is not to make the president or the government look good, right? Their job is actually to dissect everything, which, if you've dissected something, it's not a pretty sight. And so what the media does is doesn't deliver pretty things, right? They deliver the story that's on the surface, and then they deliver the possible stories that are underneath it. And sometimes those are good for those people in government, and sometimes they're not. And if you can't keep your staff on the same page, they're going to eat you up, right? Because they're going to be pointing out all of, well, you said this, but your press secretary said this a little different, and this administrator over here said it a little different this way. Which one's true, right? That's the nature of the adversarial relationship. And you're never going to be able to approach the media with here's the answer, and there's no other way to look at this, and just take this and print it, or take this and report it exactly the way we've said it. That doesn't happen anymore, right? No one in the media, regardless of whether they're conservative or whether they're liberal or where their bias is in the media, takes stories on just the prima facie presentation, right? What's on the surface. They don't do that. So, the first time Biden's trying to parse something a certain way that's going to look beneficial for him and his administration or the Democrats, the alternate story is going to come out there, right? And obviously, the Foxes and the Newsmaxes and that are on the more conservative side of center are going to go there quicker and are going to bring out the differences faster. Just as, right, those that are on left of center will be a little more forgiving about it because they're a little more seeing things the same way. It's the bias is in the news and we know it. And so, but they're not going to become the mouthpiece of the Biden administration, right? That just doesn't happen. Even you go back before Trump, right? Now, Trump is a unique instrument because, illustration, because Trump was part of the media prior to becoming president, right? Trump was already engaging the media first as a reality person, but then, right, the 4 years leading up to him running for office, he was, right, pointedly in the media attacking the Obama administration. I would do it this way, right? So he was already thinking about running for office, and so he was engaging the media there. I think that hurt him when he became president because he didn't disengage from his reality star kind of, I'm entertaining and I'm going to be controversial and I'm going to drive viewership persona to I'm the leader of the country and I've got to be careful what I say and how I say it and when I say it. That never became his style. And I think that caused him a lot of problems with the media uh, because he never got a coherent message from the whole administration out to the media at the same time. There are always a second story and a third story and a tweet. And that kind of lack of cohesiveness is a problem for an administration. Um, One of the things that I think Obama did really, really well is the way he dealt with the media, his administration dealt with the media. Um, right. And in that sense, they were a throwback to Reagan in that they stayed on topic. There weren't hardly any leaks out of the Obama administration. There weren't any kind of countervailing stories coming out from the Democrats or from the folks working with Obama. And that made it a lot easier for that administration, the Obama administration, to work in front of the media because they knew that they had control over most of the message. I think the kind of shoot from the hip approach we've seen for the last 4 years from the Trump administration is, I think, a natural Trumpian kind of approach, but it causes problems, right? In the sense that he expects people that work for him to have a message that's exactly his, but his message is delivered in a unique way, and they don't do it the same way. It leads to different arguments and different interpretations, that makes it look like the administration is going different directions. And that's exactly what you don't want to do, is put a story out there that's been sewn up, but has left a lot of loose threads that people can pull on, right? You want to seam those edges and make it airtight. You want to make it a solid piece of fabric. And I don't think those stories coming out of the Trump administration have been designed that way. It's not what they know, and they didn't go to school on the past administrations for whatever reason. But I think Reagan did a very good job of packaging all that up and saying, here's the way to deal with this. And the media wasn't nice to Reagan in any sense, but he had an innate sense of how to deal with them and how to deliver a story, and then how to actually get the media to deliver the story he wanted. He also controlled his access to the media. He continually sent other people out to deliver the administration's message. So that kept the media always wanting to be there when Reagan did come out, right? I would venture to guess there's a little bit of media burnout on Trump. They know they got to be there. They know that there's going to be something, right, that happens that'll be newsworthy. But I think they're tired of it, right? His tweets and his message, delivering of his message so much is just, worn them out in a sense, because it's always combative, derisively so, right? I mean, when you haven't seen presidents before say, telling journalists, you're biased, you're a lightweight, you're a loser, right? To the journalists, right? They just, and you still as a president have to rely upon them to deliver a message for you. Not everybody pays attention to your Twitter feed, right? Most people that want news don't pay attention to the Twitter feed. They're going to rely on the media. So that's a disconnect in the administration, I think, has been detrimental to that administration. I don't think we'll see that same problem with Biden. I think it'll be a much more disciplined approach to dealing with the media and giving information to the media, and that'll make it a smoother interaction overall. It'll still be conflictual in nature. I think that's, there'll still be the distrust and the media running okay, they said this, but, right, and go in a different direction. That's kind of their job, and that's how they make their money. So that's not going to change. But I think we'll see a more disciplined approach to how information is given to the media, and I think there'll be a more consistent approach in how the presidential Biden's administration tries to move the media to support what they're saying. And in that sense, we'll see if the presidency interacting with the media after Trump can get back to the way it was before or not, right? It may be that that's not the way it's going to be anymore. So it'll be interesting, right? So I guess what I'm saying in the end is that the last 4 years with Trump and the way the Trump administration has dealt with the media may have changed the nature of how the media views interacting with the office of president. We'll see. We've never seen it we've seen it conflictual, but we've never seen it quite as combative. Where there's actual, attacking and name calling and going on like we've seen in the last few years. So it'll be interesting. Any questions about the presidency before we move on? All right. So we're going to talk a little bit in the rest of today, I guess, about the federal court. Most of this will be talking about kind of the attributes or the elements and the pieces, the parts, and we may get to talking about some of the politics of courts. But the federal court system, first off, is so it looks like I'm getting a bad connection right now. So if you have an issue, just tell me. I got a little message saying I'm having issues. So the federal court system is a court system that there's not much in the Constitution about it. It's a pretty small system to begin with, but it is a set of courts, right? Different tiers of courts that stack one upon the other, and cases move through those mostly from the bottom to the top. There are a couple avenues that come in at different places, but for the most part, the federal court system is one built upon cases starting at the district court level and coming up through the Court of Appeals and then coming up to the Supreme Court, which are your 3 federal court levels. There's another way for stuff to come into the federal system through the state courts. Generally, if it's going to come that way, it's going to motivate from state trial courts up through courts of appeals at the state level that are based on state law. And then you would appeal out of the state court system, possibly if the avenue is there to the U.S. Supreme Court. So we'll talk a little bit about the federal courts there. Their job, right, the federal court's job is to apply federal law, right, and to interpret constitutional law and to apply, some kind of opportunity for oversight and appeal within the court system. All of the courts in the U.S. and the federal courts as well are designed around an adversarial approach to fact finding and decision making. And what that means is the underlying nature or perspective of a court system in the U.S. is that we'll get to the truth of a matter, the legal nexus of an issue, best by having adversarial relationships between people over the controversy. In other words, a prosecution and a defense. And they will be bringing a real case with a real group of people or procedures that are going to be impacted by a decision. And we're going to argue that out. And we're going to, through an adversarial process, try to win a court case. So the upshots from that, or the results of that, are one, we don't do hypothetical court cases. We don't sit down and go, well, what if this, and this, then this, right? We'd apply the law this way. We don't sit down and do that. We pass a law, we put it out there, and it starts being applied. And then if it results in arguably bad results or unfair results or unjust results, someone has to bring a lawsuit up against based on a real situation with real inequities or injustice, and argue a case, right? So we make rules and laws, we put them out there, and then we run with it until something start falling apart or breaking. And at that point, when you've got a decision-making situation where there's been application of law, and people are going, wow, this is not good. This isn't what was meant. This is wrong. This violates the Constitution or something like that. Then you've got a real controversy, and you've got a real case, and you bring it through a court, and people that are being affected argue it out, right? This needs to change because, no, this is working the way it's supposed to because. So in that sense, the court system sits back and is passive and waits for controversies to come to it, right? The federal courts are not, generally speaking, going out and looking to change something, right? They're not out there saying, oh, that's a problem, let's fix it. The problems come to them. And so the problems have to be big enough and important enough that people are willing to finance them and put in the time and the effort to bring a real case into court and spend real time and money to get it argued over. And that's essentially true of the state courts as well as the federal court system. They're both adversarial in nature. They both try to solve real controversies, and they both are passive in that they're waiting for problems to come to them. Right? They don't look them up themselves. Also, right, like the court systems at the state level, the federal court systems are generally dealing with both types of law, criminal and civil. In other words, criminal law is when an individual is charged by the state, right, by the government, with having broken a law, and they're going to be receiving some kind of punishment if they're found guilty of breaking that law. That's going to be the criminal side of things, right? And that the ranges of punishment for that could go anywhere from just fines, admonishments, up to jail time, and maybe even the application of a death penalty, right? Civil cases are cases that occur between parties, right? They're usually but not necessarily include the state or the government, whereas the criminal cases always have the state or the federal government as one of the parties, right? Because when you break the peace, you're injuring, the society as a whole, and therefore the government's involved. Civil cases don't necessarily have that, right? They can. You could have contractual cases, you could have fairness or business claims against the state, or vice versa, them against you. But civil cases don't have to include the federal government or the state governments. It can be between people. And usually it's some kind of inequity or some kind of either through contract or through payment or through service. And the parties are going to a hopefully neutral third party to come in and provide justice to the situation and make a disinterested decision based off the law. And the federal courts will provide that, right, in civil natures as well. So it's a different perspective. People aren't going to jail in a civil case. You're usually looking for compensation for something that's been lost, service for something that hasn't been delivered, right? Some kind of application to get somebody to do something, not to put them in jail. So there's no criminality there. Those are the two types of law that we see at the federal system. We see them at the state as well. So, most of the time, right, you're going to look at a U.S. district court, which is the lower level federal courts, and they're going to be doing both of these. They're going to be doing criminal cases and civil right? They're going to be applying both of those sets of laws depending upon what kind of case is in front of them. And then the courts above that, the U.S. Courts of Appeal and the Supreme Court, mostly are going to be hearing appellate cases, right, from those that come up initially from the district court. So the U.S. district courts, right, the lowest level federal courts, the U.S. district courts, are courts of original jurisdiction most of the time, right? That's where you're, except in special circumstances, that's the court that's going to be deciding fact from fiction, truth from falsity, and delivering a verdict, right? Finding for one party or the other based on law. And so a court that does that is a court of original jurisdiction. And for most all cases at the federal level, that's the district court's job, is to be that original court of jurisdiction. All of them, though, right, have the opportunity above the U.S. district courts, so the Court of Appeals and Supreme Court do have some unique original jurisdictions, and you don't need to know exactly what those are, but just know that, right, there are some types of cases or some cases with particular types of claims that are going to come directly into the Supreme Court, maybe, right? An appeal might come into them, to the U.S. Supreme Court from the states, and that will not go through the U.S. Court of Appeals, right? Generally speaking, though, you're going to have the U.S. District Court make a decision, and if one of the parties believes that there was some kind of misapplication of the law or some bad decision on the part of the judge during the administration of the law, they'll appeal to the U.S. Courts of Appeal. So appellate courts, like the U.S. Courts of Appeal, their job is to review how the law was applied at the previous level court, and to see if all of the procedures that were employed in that trial were employed correctly. Right? The U.S. Courts of Appeal, when they're doing an appeal from a U.S. district court, they're not trying to figure out who's guilty or who's innocent. They're not coming up with a verdict, right? They're reviewing the record of the court decision that was made below them. And they're saying, okay, well, here are all the decisions that the judge made. Here's the law that he said applied. Here's how it was described and worked its way out during the case. Is this the right way to do this, right? And if the U.S. Court of Appeals is looking at that and says, no, this judge didn't apply the law the right way, they're going to say, look, this law is supposed to be applied this way, and they'll describe it. And then they'll tell that judge, that court, redo this and apply the law like this, right, when you get to that part of the trial. And so they'll remand it to that court to redo the work. That might change the verdict of that lower court, and it might not. But what it does is it ensures that there's a uniform application of law in courts of original jurisdiction. So in a sense, that Court of Appeals is providing oversight in how lower courts do their work. The Supreme Court sits above the U.S. Court of Appeals, doing generally the same thing. It's mostly an appellate court. Sometimes, though, it does have some original jurisdiction coming out of the Constitution, and we'll talk about that as we move through the chapter. So when you look at our Constitution, you look at the court system it built, it really only mentions the U.S. Supreme Court. It says, the Constitution says there will be, right, a Supreme Court, basically. Doesn't even really tell you too much about what that court's going to do. Most of the exercise of the Supreme Court is simply right, appeals based upon constitutionality of law below it. So they're looking at decisions that were made, the application of federal law, the application of federal law in light of the interpretation of what the Constitution says. And the Supreme Court is saying, we believe what was done here, the law that was made here, the application of law here is or is not constitutional, and that it matches up with how we interpret the Constitution to be saying what it says. And that was kind of the original intent. In 1789, right, not too long after, right, we got the second Constitution in place, we had a legislative act, the Judiciary Act 1789, that created the U.S. Courts of Appeals and the U.S. District Courts. Right, so those are courts of statutory creation. They came out of statute from the legislature. The U.S. Supreme Court is our constitutional court. And so the Judiciary Act established the U.S. Court of Appeals and U.S. District Courts as feeders underneath the Supreme Court. Right, court cases can feed up through them. Just, administratively speaking, right, we've got one U.S. Supreme Court. There are 12 federal courts of appeal across the United States that have a direct line feeding to the Supreme Court. Under those courts of appeals, there are about 90 some odd different federal district courts. And remember, those district courts are usually your courts of finding fact and delivering verdicts. So courts of original jurisdiction. And then, as I've mentioned, you've got all the courts that come out of the state systems that can feed in as well, eventually to the U.S. courts. So the district courts, right? What do they actually do? What's their original jurisdiction? Well, application of federal law, so all federal crimes, right? That are violations of a criminal nature that are based off federal law. Civil suits that come under federal law. Civil suits that occur between citizens of different states. Right, you've got to have something here to, right, sort out the differences, because if I'm a citizen in state A and I'm suing a citizen in state B, right, our states may have very different laws about how things go in our states. But part of the job here of the federal court system is to take care of that problem. So if a civil suit is big enough, 75,000, that may have changed since it may be higher now. But, of a certain level, right, if there's a certain amount of money on the line between citizens of different states, then it's going to be an original jurisdiction for a federal court. Because we don't want either citizen of either state to be disadvantaged or advantaged by their state or the other state's laws. So we'll bring it into the federal realm. Bankruptcy hearings, right, which is the ability to discharge debts legally. We don't want states to have that. It needs to be something that's managed across the top. Administrative agencies reviewing their actions. So in other words, what the federal government's bureaucracy has done, and right. So when they're applying statutory law from the federal Congress, it's been signed by the president, right? The executive branch is putting that work into action. Sometimes that's pretty controversial, and sometimes what's happening there may need to have some kind of oversight and review, and courts can provide that. Admiralty and maritime mean cases that are on the water, either the open seas, admiralty, or maritime, which is the open waters within the country. Right, almost all of our, I shouldn't say almost all, a good number of our big rivers are all those state boundaries. Something that goes wrong, it's going to be another one of those problems of, do we try this? Say it happens in the Mississippi River by Memphis, right? Do you try it in Tennessee or do you try it in Arkansas? If it happens near St. Louis, do you try it in Illinois or do you try it in Missouri, right? Because it was on water. So the simplification of that is, if it's a maritime case, an admiralty case, which is the open seas, it's going to probably be federal in nature. And then anytime we're going to be naturalizing folks, in other words, making them U.S. citizens, that's the job of U.S. judges and justices. So the supervision of that process falls to the courts as well. So the district courts, right? These are the things that we're definitely going to be starting and be decided at that level. How these decisions, how laws applied here, will generate the information needed. The decisions made will generate information that could feed into a court of appeals, right? Which we talked about earlier, is providing that opportunity to review the application of law, review the decisions of the district court, and see how they fall in line with what's intended. Again, the point of the U.S. Court of Appeals is to make sure the district courts are applying the federal law the way they're supposed to, right? The way that the appellate courts believe is constitutional and proper. So when you appeal a case, you're appealing it based on some kind of procedural error, some kind of misapplication of law. You're not saying, hey, the district court found me guilty and I'm not, try my case over. You're saying, hey, the district court, right, made this decision, the judge, to apply the law this way. Because of that application, inappropriate application of law, I was found guilty. And I don't think that would be the case if this law were applied correctly. So the appellate court's job is to review that and say, yes, you're right, or no, you're not. And if you're not, they'll say, we affirm, right, the decision of the district court, which means what they did was appropriate. If it's not appropriate, then they will remand that case to the district court and say, you applied this part of the law at this point of the case incorrectly. So go back, and when you get to this point, do it right. Here's what doing it right means. Do that, and then finish the case. And if your decision is still the same, then so be it, right? If it doesn't, maybe it doesn't affect the outcome of the case, but it might. So do it in the right way, and let's see. That's what underlies those courts of appeal and what they're going to be putting out as a decision. The Supreme Court, right, we get up to the top, it's a little different, right? The Supreme Court is both a court of original jurisdiction, like the district courts, and they're an appellate court, like the U.S. Courts of Appeal. So they have jurisdiction on both sides. Their original jurisdiction comes out of the Constitution, right? It's in Article 3. And it's, here, I don't have that at hand. We could go look that up real quick, I guess, if we wanted to, and say, what are those original cases that would come out of Article 3? And I'll just give you a real quick survey of that, right? The Article 3 of the Constitution is basically that laws of the United States, treaties, cases of admiralty and maritime jurisdiction, controversies between the states, right? Controversies between citizens of the state, ambassadors, consuls, ministers, those kind of things. Trials of case of impeachment, right? These are some of the things. Treason, right? Not much going on with treason, but that's one of them. So there's some places, right, where the U.S. Supreme Court has some original jurisdiction. Not just a ton of them, right? Foreign states making cases against U.S. citizens or U.S. subjects, right, would be the kind of thing that we would see there. Those are really few and far between most of the time. Generally, what the Supreme Court is looking at is appeals coming out of the courts of appeals. They're looking at the different, right, courts of appeals, right, from the different districts, and what they're looking at is maybe District 1 Court of Appeals is looking at a case over a particular issue, and they said the law should be this way. And then they're looking at District 3, who tried a case that's very much the same, and District 3 Court of Appeals said the law should be applied a different way. So now you've got two different district courts of appeals, right, telling the courts below them to do law differently. That's a problem. So that's the kind of case where we're going to get an appeal, right, from the district up to the U.S. Supreme Court saying which one of these is correct, right? So a lot of times that's what the Supreme Court is looking on, as settling differences of the application of law and the appellate law that's been applied between the districts. The other places you're going to get appeals coming out of states, from the states' Supreme Courts, right? So say Texas, the Supreme Court renders a verdict at the Texas level, the application of some civil law, and right, that could get appealed out. Most of the time, the ones coming out of Texas to the federal courts, the Supreme Court, are going to be ones that are based off of death penalty cases, where the Texas Criminal Appeals Court, Court of Criminal Appeals, is looking at it and saying, is there an application of justice here for the death penalty that's unfair, inequitable, or something like that? And that's going to be an appeal up to the Supreme Court to say, hey, are we violating the Constitution in the application of the death penalty here? Is it cruel and unusual punishment? Is it something like, does it fit somewhere there? So you'll see some of those. Recent cases from the state level that have made it into U.S. courts have been a lot of cases that have dealt with voting laws, election laws, state district redrawing of political district boundaries, gerrymandering. Those are the kind of things that are coming up. Challenges to abortion as a right, and how much the state can limit the right to an abortion, or the application of abortion. Second Amendment gun rights, right, where states have some authority to put limitations on rights, but they can't take them away. And so when the states make an application of a restriction on a right, somebody's challenging that, saying this goes to the heart of a right I have as a citizen that's to be protected by the federal government. So they challenge the state government through the federal court system, and the states are having to defend their application of law against a U.S. citizen and the rights that they have as a U.S. citizen. So we'll see that those kind of things work their way out through appeals out of the states into the federal systems. Does that make sense? All right. So, right, we see the Supreme Court focused a lot of time on conflicts between states, conflicts between district courts, and then looking after, right, the national supremacy of either federal law or constitutional law as it's applied down to the states. So um, that's where a bulk of their work, their casework actually is focused on. Right, those three areas: conflicts between the states, national supremacy, or conflicts between interpretation of the law between the districts. Um, all right. So how do we put these judges out there? Um, Federal courts, all of them, are done the same way. Federal judges are appointed. They are selected by the president. They are vetted ostensibly by the president, appointed by the president, and then the Senate, right, the U.S. Senate has the constitutional obligation to go through the confirmation process. If they confirm an individual to a particular federal court seat, then they are appointed for life. The only way that they lose their job is to resign, to pass away, or to be impeached and convicted out of that position. And of course, the impeachment conviction process requires, right, some kind of assertion that they're not doing their job properly, and that the U.S. Congress, the House in particular, will go through the impeachment process, and the Senate in particular will hold the trial about whether to remove them from office. Generally, what happens to get them there is the president picks them, appoints them, says, here's who I want, and here's where I want them to be assigned, and here's, right, the information that I've been looking at that I'm using to select them for this position. Really prior to the last 2 years of the Obama administration, if the senators in the area where the judge was going to be appointed were okay for doing an appointment to a U.S. district court, and that district court was in Texas, if the two U.S. senators from Texas didn't have a problem, the Senate would confirm that appointment. Right? It was pretty simple, right? I mean, they got the same information the president did in the sense of who this person was. The American Bar Association usually does a vetting process and then gives just a thumbs up or a thumbs down kind of, yeah, they're qualified, or no, they're not. The Senate, right, always through the confirmation process will bring these appointees in and do confirmation hearings where they'll ask them questions, get a feel for who they are, what their record is. But prior to the last 2 years of the Obama administration, this was it was fairly unusual to not get an appointee confirmed. Right, usually senatorial courtesy was the biggest barrier, and if those senators from the affected district were saying this person's fine, then they followed the president's appointment. When Mitch McConnell decided that they weren't even going to have a confirmation hearing for Obama's appointment of Neil Gorsuch? No, Merrick Garland. That was a unique thing. It's become more standard now since then, but usually we didn't have a whole lot of angst about appointments to the Supreme Court or lower courts. U.S. Supreme Court appointees usually got a lot more attention than district court appointees, or Court of Appeals. But even still, they'd be questioned. Most of the time, though, they went through, right? Most of the time they got appointed. If you look at all of the appointments, right, over time, 80% of those folks generally get appointed. Whoops, did I click? Nope. Okay. So the interesting thing is that this is not usually a stair-step approach. You get appointed to the U.S. District Courts, that's probably where you're going to be. You might get promoted up to a U.S. Courts of Appeals at some point, but most of the time that doesn't happen. And then the U.S. Supreme Court, it hardly ever happens that you're actually bringing someone from the U.S. Court of Appeals up and elevating them. Almost always presidents are picking people, as we've seen with the last few, right, are candidates that are outside of the court system, outside of the justice system, and appointing them. And one of the reasons for that is that if you elevate someone from the U.S. District Courts or the U.S. Courts of Appeals, there's a whole federal case history that comes along with them of all the cases they've been deciding, which gives the Senate a lot of material to chew on. If you appoint someone that hasn't served in the federal judiciary, they don't have a lot of smoking gun decisions that could point back at them, right? And so it's essentially you're picking someone new with not much experience. There's nothing that can be brought out of that lack of experience that can hurt their nomination, except that they have a lack of experience. And this last Supreme Court appointee, Comey Barrett, is a perfect example of that, right? Never really tried any cases at all, right? Pretty much is either always served as a judge or as a law professor, but never actually been an attorney, trying cases. So that kind of situation limits the amount of information that might be used against them. 8 out of 10 times, 80% of the time, when the president makes an appointment, a nomination, that nomination does end up getting appointed. Only 20% of the time does it fail. Will be interesting to see what happens as we move forward with the Senate and the way that's become much more combative in the last few years, last 6 years. So when they do fail, they fail because the president and their party's in the minority in the Senate. Presidents at the end of their term, right? Although that didn't seem to apply to the Comey Barrett issue, or they've got something that sticks out that makes them essentially a weak candidate. Historically, the fact that they're from another party hasn't stopped them from being appointed. But that seems to be what we're moving toward in the last few years, right? Is that, and we'll see how true that is if Biden gets a U.S. Supreme Court nomination opportunity, if the Senate is still in the hands of the Republicans, and they do what they did last time with Merrick Garland, which was just refuse to have a confirmation hearing, then we'll have to start considering that nomination failures from a minority party president are going to become more the norm than not. It's not, I think, what was expected or understood to be the process from early on, but it seems to have developed that way, which is kind of a sad thing. What's this fuss about court packing? Well, there's nothing in the Constitution that says that the Supreme Court shall be comprised of a certain number of spots. So the Congress, through legislation, can determine how many people serve on the U.S. Supreme Court. And they can lower that number or they can increase that number by passing legislation. So when you heard, and this was prior to the election, you heard discussion about court packing, the assumption was that the Senate and the House were both going to be majority in the Democratic Party. And so since the Democrats were having issues with the way the Republican senators have been handling the nomination process, the confirmation process, they were going to try to balance out, right? I mean, because what's happened, right, is that Obama nominated Merrick Garland, who was a moderate Democrat, which would have given the court an ideological slant toward the left, just a little to the left, because he was a centrist. But instead, they just refused to hold that hearing until after Obama was out of office. Trump came in, and they put what's his name in there, the frat boy that was drugged through the mud with his partying and drinking. I've lost his name now. But a Republican, right? And they put him on there, which, right, kept a Republican majority on the Supreme Court. And then with Comey Barrett, right, we put another Republican on there, right, because Ginsburg, right, a Democrat, died. So now you've got 6 out of the 9 justices are Republicans. And from that was, right, too political, and it robbed them of at least one seat, the Merrick Garland seat, which would have kept it a 5-4 for a while, and then it would have slipped to a 5-4 the other way with this last appointment. But right now it's 6-3. So the Democrats, anticipating winning majority of seats in the House and a majority of seats in the Senate, right, have the ability, right, to pass legislation that says we're going to expand the seats from 9 to 11, right? And that would give now President-elect Biden 2 appointments to the court, which would then, right, make it 6-5 Republican. Or maybe they go, instead of 11, they go to 13, and he gets 4 appointments. And now, right, it's 9-6 or whatever, right? Or 7-6 in favor of the Democrats. The fact that the Constitution doesn't have any set number of judges to be on the Supreme Court allows the opportunity for the Congress to pass legislation to pack the court, to expand the court. Now, obviously, right, that requires both the House and the Senate to be one party, and probably the president to be of that party as well, for this to be considered to happen. So if those 2 seats in Georgia that are up for re-election, Senate seats, both go to the Democrats, that will give the Democrats control of the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and this court packing idea might be possible again. Does that make sense? Yeah, so essentially what the whole thing is that this whole process of appointing people to the Supreme Court especially, but it's also very important at the Court of Appeals level and the U.S. District Courts, right? There are literally hundreds of new judges that have been put into place by Trump, right, are changing the political makeup, the political ideology of these courts. And the expectation is greater now than ever that those new appointees will bring their politics into their decision making, not just the law. Because, I mean, to be frank about it, right, what your political ideology is can determine how you read the law and what you think it means. And so, you know, whether you have and generally this discussion revolves around what we call originalist and activist judges. And the distinction there is that originalists generally argue that they try to understand the Constitution and the time frame that it was written in and apply it from that perspective. And activist judges are interpreting the Constitution from our experiences and our exercises in politics today, which results in a new or reinterpreted perspective of what those words mean compared to an originalist approach, right? So it's very much the same kind of debate that we see that happens between religions, right? Is happening between what we have as an expectation for our jurists when they get appointed to these courts. And so, you know, if you think that what the founding fathers wrote in 1780s, right, doesn't need to be altered and still perfectly applicable to the world today, then you want people appointed to the court that have that same idea as their guiding tenets for reading the Constitution. If you think the Constitution was written to be agile and flexible so that it could work as the society changed, it could still work without having to be amended all the time, then you're probably looking at that Constitution as a more live document, right? Being able to respond to the world as it is today. And you want your judges to interpret it so that it's applicable given today's world, not the interpretations from 250 years ago. Both of those are perspectives that our judges bring to the court with them. And so who we choose to appoint might very well, from that philosophical perspective, determine how they're going to make law, how they're going to interpret law, how they're going to apply law, right? So the other thing that might impact that is who these people actually are, right? Whether they're lawyers with a lot of experience or a little experience, what that experience is. Are they male, female, right? White, black, brown, whatever, right? All of these demographics might matter to the way they make their decisions as well. And so it's not just which side of the fence are they on political party wise or interpretation wise, but their demographics might matter as well, right? What we do know is that in the most recent past, they've been mostly lawyers, mostly white. They've certainly been partisan politicians in the sense that they're engaged in politics at the local and state levels. That's how they come to be noticed by presidents to be appointed to begin with. Right. So, and they've got some kind of legal experience that can be used to say who they are and that they'll be a good judge. So we'll, you know, demographics may be just as important as politics or philosophy. Once they're there, they've got a lot of work to do. The Supreme Court in particular gets somewhere between 8,000 and 9,000 cases a year petitioned to them. Out of that, they're going to choose, 75 to 90, somewhere around 80 cases to actually hear and make decisions on. Assuming that the court stays at 9, right now, right, the rule is that if 4 of those 9 justices want to hear a case, then that's all that those 4 say that, then they'll bring the case up for hearing. So we were reading their staff and them are working through these 8,000 cases, and they're coordinating, do you want to hear this or not want to hear this? And that's all fed in together, and that helps decide the docket for a year at the Supreme Court. If 4 of them decide they want to hear the same case, then a writ of certiorari is issued, and that'll bring the case up for consideration before the court. Generally, the types of cases that they issue a writ for are going to be civil liberties cases, right? The liberties that individual citizens have that need to be protected, especially where lower district courts are debating, right, handing out different decisions. They're going to want to settle those. And then they're going to want to settle any kind of conflict between what they've issued in the past and new lower court rulings that may conflict with what they've done in the past. All of those are places where the Supreme Court needs to work, right? Needs to make a decision to settle, to make sure that there's some kind of uniformity occurring across the country. The person responsible for representing the U.S. government in front of the Supreme Court is called the Solicitor General. So if the U.S. government is a party to a case, the Solicitor General will decide whether to try to appeal the Supreme Court or not if the government's lost. If the Solicitor General's wanting to try a case, that will at least be on the radar for the Supreme Court justices as well, because the Solicitor General representing the United States is saying, hey, we lost this case and this is bad for the federal government, take a look, right? And they'll decide whether they do or not. Just because the Solicitor General wants it doesn't guarantee it'll happen. The actual practice of the U.S. Supreme Court is a biweekly rotation between hearing cases and writing opinions. So for 2 weeks, they'll sit in the courtroom and listen to cases come through. Then they'll take 2 weeks off from the courtroom, sit in their offices and in their conference rooms and make decisions and write opinions. And then they'll go back into the courtroom with new cases and do that process over again. Most of the time, they're only giving the attorneys of the two sides 30 minutes to make their case in the Supreme Court. So some of these, these cases, these huge cases, are going to change the country. The actual argumentation that goes into it is about an hour before the judge is in the courtroom. They obviously have all of the briefs, all of the first opinions, the lower court opinions. If the interest groups, right, that we talked about earlier, are filing friend of the court briefs, amicus curiae briefs, they have that information. So all of that information they'll have ahead of time. When they have their hour of hearing, the justices are usually coming in there already kind of knowing what they want to do, given what they've read. That hour is an hour for those attorneys to make an appealing case to them, and for them to ask questions about where they think the law is going to go if they decide this way versus this way. And so if you listen to that, you'll quite often hear those kinds of questions from the bench to the attorney. So, okay, so you said this is going to happen if we decide in your favor. So let's say we do. How does that work when, right? That's the kind of questions you'll hear them ask quite often, which are interesting, right? Because that's them, right, teasing out, right, the long-term implications of what possible decisions might be. So it can be really interesting. Once the time is up and they've heard the case, then it gets scheduled for conference just between the justices, right? They go in, they bring a case up, and they talk about it, right? They move through a seniority, chief justice, because of, right, they're the leader of the court, and then seniority down through the justices, and they say what they think ought to happen and why. Once everybody's kind of laid it out and the court knows which way they're going from the positions they've taken, then an opinion gets assigned out to be written. Generally, the Chief Justice writes it if the Chief Justice is in the majority. If they're not, then they will assign the opinion to someone, or they will assign the opinion to someone else who's in the majority. If the Chief Justice is not in the majority, then the senior judge, the person that's been there the longest, that's in the majority, will write the opinion or assign it. That's just for the court opinion. There are conflicting opinions that can be written. Every justice can write their own opinion if they want to. So sometimes you'll get a decision from the court where 5 judges will say this is the answer, but they might have 4 or 5 different reasons for why that's the answer. So they'll write their own briefs explaining, I think this is the right answer, but here's why. Dissenting opinions from the other judges can be the same way. We think this is the wrong answer. The right answer ought to be this, and for this reason, right? So there's no guarantee that the majority is all going to be believing the same thing and writing the same thing, but generally they do, right? Generally, the majority forms around one major thrust of a legal argument. So as I said, those dissenting opinions can be written by the justices that are not part of the majority and say why something's wrong. Other justices in the majority can write concurring opinions and say yes, but, right? So it's very interesting to see all of the opinions that come out with the case. Quite often, dissenting opinions are written with an eye to this law is probably going to be, from my perspective, going to be overturned in the next few years. And the reason it's going to be overturned is because of this. So I'm going to write an opinion that lays out the legal perspective as ammunition for those people coming behind me. Right? My dissenting opinion will become the majority opinion if I'm lucky. So the minority sometimes looks at their dissenting opinions as doing that. Same can be said as for concurring opinions. Generally speaking, though, the Supreme Court is a fairly conservative institution, which from a court position means that view stare decisis as their base for making decisions, right? They're looking at how they decided things in the past, trying to make as little change as possible going forward, and staying with what has worked and what they know. The interesting thing about this is that once the decision is made, once it's out there, the court says this is what the law means. This is how the Constitution is interpreted. Here's where we're going. They can issue that decision, but it's going to take the legislature, or it's going to take the executive branch, or it's going to take the states who have actual authority to make things happen to use that decision and follow that decision. Right? The courts do not have any implementation authority. They need other people to do what they say. So here's an example. Texas had 3 of its U.S. House districts determined to be unconstitutional by a U.S. District Court. Right? U.S. District Court 5, I think, said these 3 districts in Texas are unconstitutional because of the way the political boundaries were drawn. That meant Texas legislature fix this problem, redraw these boundaries, and the Texas legislature didn't. So the decision, right, that came from the federal district court was telling the state legislature to do their job, only do it this way, and Texas legislature said, not now. And so we still, 3 years later, have 3 U.S. House districts that are unconstitutional. So generally, right, these decisions rely upon, right, good faith that the other governments below them will implement them. So, which the last minute here, I guess, the last slide from this asks you to think a little bit about how the courts approach their job, how the justices approach their job. Should they be courts that sit back and only change as little as possible to keep things working? Or should they, when they recognize injustice or problems, view it as part of their job to fix things? Are they active or passive? Should they make policy new out of whole cloth? Should they simply interpret the current law and, right, tweak things a little bit? Really, if you put it in the current vernaculars, should the judiciary show restraint? Should they be conservative, or should the judiciary show an activism streak? Should they be trying to right wrongs? A lot of this how you answer this might depend upon your own politics and your own position ideologically, but it's a good thought to think about, right? How should the courts approach their job? If you think and argue for judicial restraint, how far back should that go? Right? Should we still be making decisions based on 1789, 1889, 1989? At what point does the conservatism yield itself to some change? And conversely, if you think a court ought to be activist, if you think judges ought to be righting wrongs, at what point do they become so active they start replacing the policymakers that the Constitution actually talks about, the legislature and the president, right? Should they be so activist that they're stepping on top of folks that were elected to make laws when they were just appointed to interpret laws? So neither one of these approaches, right, restraint, conservative, activism, and liberal, has a really, strong argument that can support them all the time. And so you should think about it. So.